We are going to cover a theory that's going to destroy the Big Bang when it gets into the mainstream. It's called the Hydroplate theory. Has anybody ever heard of the Hydroplate theory? Okay, 1, 2. Oh yeah, the St. Cloud State guys know the Hydroplate. And it's my favorite talk because it answers so many questions. And this was the 8th edition. It's in 2009 or so. And it was a $30 book, and the last one on Amazon went for $280. And now the used ones are going for like 70 or 80 bucks. So it's a good theory. I mean, my old science books, probably the worst investment I ever made is I bought some science books at St. Cloud State to see what they were teaching, and it was 210 bucks. And I went to sell them back at the end of the quarter, and they'd give me like 10 for one and nothing for the other. Oh, but not this book. And now we've got the 9th edition, which is a 2019 copyright, but it's still not in print for whatever reason. You can download a PDF, or you can see a PDF of it on rsr.org. That's Real Science Radio, rsr.org/HTP, Hydroplate Theory, HPT. There's some really good websites. I think I put them on the cheat sheet for you guys. Brian Nickel has a really, really good way of explaining it. I use a lot of his slides. And basically, you know, going back to the last talk, they said that NASA said the Earth's oldest rock was found on the moon. And this rock formed 12 miles below the surface. It's like, well, how in the world does that happen? Well, that brings us to the Hydroplate. It was developed by Dr. Walt Brown, who went to West Point. And he was an Army Ranger and a paratrooper. And he got his PhD from MIT in mechanical engineering. And he ran the Benet military lab. He was the top dog, and he had dozens of PhDs working for him and a bunch of other people. And so he's a really sharp guy. And in the 70s, he's going through South Dakota, and he hears on the radio that somebody claimed to have found Noah's Ark on a mountain. And he thought he was crazy. You know, he was an evolutionist at the time. But in South Dakota, there's not much to do but besides see the wall drug signs, right? And so just because he was bored, I think, this is how I think it happened, he just humored the guys. Okay, if there was an ark on a mountain, that means the whole world was covered with water. And that means a whole bunch of plants and animals got buried in mud and turned into fossils. And he thought, wait a minute, if fossils are evidence for the flood, what's the evidence for evolution? And he started to ask his colleagues, his really smart colleagues, and after 2 years of asking them that question, he didn't have any evidence for evolution. And so he became a creationist, and then he came up with this Hydroplate theory. And I gave this book to a professor a long time ago because they don't have a theory for Grand Canyon that works. So geologists will look at this because their theory doesn't work. And she had it for about 6 months, and we got together and talked for about an hour and a half. And she said, the science works if the assumption is true. She just didn't believe the assumption. And the assumption is like, well, why not? But the one assumption is that half of the ocean was inside the Earth at one time. That's the one assumption. See, most theories, they take a look at what we have and try and figure out how it got there. We're looking at the effect and try and figure out what caused it. We know what the effect is, but the cause is unknown. This is different. He sets up the cause with one assumption and then lets the laws of physics go at it and gives us the effects that are known. So it's a very, very solid theory because the less assumptions you have, the better it is. And the more accurate predictions you make, the better it is. So this, you can't get much less than one. And it's making probably half a dozen astounding predictions, and we'll cover them at the end. Yeah, so the one assumption is that the Earth, half of the ocean was inside the Earth at one time. So just think of the Earth as a big apple, and the skin is 60 miles thick made of granite. And then there's a layer of water underneath that, and that's going to be the water, about a mile thick. And then underneath that is the mantle. That's the one assumption, okay? And then you throw the laws of physics at it. You know, if this was the moon, it's going to tug on the Earth and get high tide and low tide, right? And so it's going to tug on the crust also. And back then, the crust wasn't broken into plates like it is today. It was just the crust. And so it got stretch and compress, stretch and compress. If I had a wire and I bend it back and forth, it gets hotter and hotter. That's what was happening with the crust. The crust was getting hotter and hotter. And the heat went into the water got hotter and hotter. It wanted to boil, but there wasn't any room to expand. It couldn't boil. And so at 705 degrees and 3,200 psi, pounds per square inch, it became supercritical water, where it's not really water and it's not really steam, but whatever it is, it dissolves things like crazy. So now it's dissolving the granite above and the mantle below, and it's mixing it together and making stuff like limestone and salts and quartz, which is sand, and it's making all this stuff, and that explains where the limestone came from. Because Walt Brown, he was teaching at the same college as Bob Dietz, Robert Dietz, and that's the guy that came up with the term seafloor spreading, you know, plate tectonics. And Walt Brown asked him one time, where'd all the limestone come from? And Dietz said, beats the blank out of me, because every time limestone forms, it releases carbon dioxide. And there's 60,000 times more limestone than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what's happening, and Brian Nickel does a video on this on his YouTube channel, The Origin of Limestone, and you can see the chemical formulas and how it's it's getting recycled in that subterranean water chamber. It's going to turn into calcium carbonate or whatever, and it gets recycled down there. So now you got carbon dioxide down there, you got limestone, you got salt, silica, sand, stuff like that down there, and it's at the bottom of the chamber. And the crust is getting weaker and weaker, and it's getting hotter and hotter, and it's getting weaker and weaker, and finally it erupts. And Walt Brown says it's 372,000 psi. Can you imagine that? 372,000. If that was in this bucket, if that was that much pressure in here, and I just cracked this open, it'd probably destroy this whole church. Just boom, go into atmospheric pressure, and that's what happened with the subterranean water under so much pressure, and the crust finally cracked, and it just erupted out of there with tremendous force, and that crack went in two directions, and it went all the way around the world and came back together again. And the water gushed up with tremendous force, and that's how it could rain for 40 days and 40 nights. See, with our weather system, it can't. But with that, a fountain just shooting up water, it can. And then people say, well, if that's the case, wouldn't it leave a mark on the earth? And I say, yeah, absolutely. That's what the mid-oceanic ridge is. That's this line, this mountain range that goes through the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian. At the bottom of every mountain range, or every ocean, there's this one mountain range, the mid-oceanic ridge, 46,000 miles long. Okay, so that's the mark. And so now you've got two cliffs 60 miles high with water just gushing out of there with just tremendous force. And on Earth, you can only get a cliff 5 miles high before it starts to crush the stuff below. And so now you got this stuff crumbling into this water that's shooting up with tremendous force. That's where the sediment came from. The granite and the basalt down below, that's where the sediment came for the layers of sedimentary rock. Plus there's silica and calcium stuff in there. That's a cementing agent in that water too. That's how the sand turned into sandstone. Okay, so that's all mixed together real well, and it's shooting up with tremendous force. So these cliffs are getting farther and farther and farther apart, and eventually there's nothing pushing down on the mantle. And so it bulges. And now that's higher in one spot, and the raised continents start sliding. North America and South America start sliding to the west, and Africa and Europe start sliding to the east, and they keep going until they meet resistance or run out of water. And then it's like a rug going into a wall. It's going to buckle. And so that's how the mountains formed. The mountains formed, and that's why the major, like the Rockies and the Andes, they're parallel to the mid-Atlantic ridge. And so then you got the mountains rise up, so you got a big mass on a small base that sinks in. Well, if something sinks in, something else has to rise up. That's where the plateaus came from. They can't explain plateaus because they grew, there's a lot of unanswered questions. So it sunk down, the plateaus rise up. And then similarly, this mid-oceanic ridge rises up. Well, something has to sink in, and that's going to be the Pacific Ocean. That's the ring of fire. That's why the Pacific Ocean is so much different than the rest of the oceans, because it's got like 40,000 table mounts and volcanic activity, and it's also got the trenches. Mariana Trench, that's in the Pacific. Most of the trenches are in the Pacific because it got sucked down. And so then the water which was covering the Earth gushes off to fill up the Pacific Ocean. And then it cuts canyons in the continental shelf. There's submarine canyons that can't form today. You know, like the Amazon and the Ganges, the Hudson, there's submarine canyons that are on the shelf, but you can't cut a canyon under the water like that. And so it cut the canyons in the continental shelf, and the continents sunk in, and the oceans rose up, and so it buried those canyons. That's how those got there. And there's a canyon in Greenland under 2 kilometers of ice, and it was cut by a river, because it's sharp. You know, if it was a glacier, it'd be more U-shaped, but this is more V-shaped. So it's cut by a river. And then down in Antarctica, you've got lakes under 2 miles of ice. Liquid water in Antarctica. And so how does that happen? Well, it's the Ice Age. We can explain the Ice Age. See, the water gushed off Greenland, cut the canyon, and then the Ice Age filled it up. You know, they got like 40 theories for why the Ice Age started and stuff, and that means none of them work. And once the Ice Age started, why would it stop? It's reflecting more and more heat away from the continents. But we can explain it, because for an Ice Age to happen, you need warmer winters, or at least warmer oceans, so you get more precipitation, but you need cooler summers so it doesn't melt. So an Ice Age is just snows more than it melts year after year after year. And we can explain the warmer oceans, well, with all that volcanic activity in the Pacific, that's going to heat it up, so you're going to get more precip coming down on the continents. But then how come it doesn't melt? Well, Walt Brown says the continents were higher, therefore cooler. Plus, you're going to have all these aerosols in the atmosphere from the volcanoes, which is going to filter out the heat from the sun. 400 or 500 years of it snowing more than it melts, you're going to get the Ice Age. And you're going to get glaciers everywhere, except parts of Alaska and Siberia. Where there's permafrost today, they didn't have a glacier during the Ice Age. And that just didn't make any sense to me. When I saw that, it's like, man, why is that? Well, it's because it was closer, it was lower, and it was closer to the ocean, so it came down as rain. It didn't come down as snow. Then why did the Ice Age stop? Well, during those 400 or 500 years, the oceans are cooling off, so there's less precip. Plus the atmosphere is clearing up, so more heat's coming through from the sun. So 400 or 500 years to get the Ice Age, and then a couple hundred years for it to melt away. And to a certain extent, we're still recovering from it. The global warming thing, they think that the Earth is so fragile. With the climate alarmists, I just say, let's wait for an accurate prediction. In the 70s, you were freaking out over the next Ice Age coming. And it's always 12 years from now. We got to do something or the world's going to end in 12 years. And just search failed climate predictions, and you get 50 years of failed predictions. And the premise that they have is like, we have to get rid of CO2. Well, CO2 is plant food. If we had more carbon dioxide, we'd have more food and less droughts. And the main thing that they keep out of the thing is sunspots. There's a good book on the table out there, I think. It's called Inconvenient Facts by Gregory Wrightstone. And you can hear him being interviewed on Real Science Radio. And again, we need to get all the information to make informed decisions, but a lot of times you aren't going to get all the information because somebody wants their grant renewed. You know, and so, yeah, and Marcus, he was in one of the talks this weekend, and he was saying he was surprised to find out that the main greenhouse gas is water vapor. It's like 90% of it. So anyhow, that's a different topic for another talk, but that's the Ice Age. And so what do we find? Like in the Antarctica, we find palm trees and evidence of dinosaurs and alligators in Antarctica. And in the up north of the Arctic Circle in Axel Island, they find like badgers and snakes and stuff. It's like, how does that live there? Plus, they found a mammoth standing up, frozen, flash frozen. It still had identifiable food in his stomach. Any deer hunter out there? Anybody deer hunt? Yeah, what do you do when what's the first thing you do when you shoot the deer? Yeah, you take you gut it, otherwise the heat is going to destroy the meat. Well, this thing flash froze. It froze the stuff that was in the stomach on an elephant, you know? And so it had to get like 150 below zero, which doesn't happen naturally. And it was standing up, so it was buried alive, you know? Dead things don't tend to stand up very well. And so how do we explain that? Well, some of the stuff that was coming up from the subterranean water chambers that had so much force it escaped our atmosphere and got super cold outside the atmosphere. And then it's like a heat sink out there. The heat goes from hot to cold, so it just sucked all out. So you got this, the water shooting up there turning into ice. You got carbon dioxide shooting up there turning into dry ice, and you get all these minerals turning up, and it's like muddy hail. And then the gravity grabbed it and pulled it back down and buried the mammoths on big muddy hail. And I don't know how deep it buried it. And then the flood was above it. And then, okay, so that's how you freeze them. But mammoths don't live in the Arctic. They eat too much, they drink too much, their nose is going to freeze off the first night. They don't live in the Arctic, and they're not woolly, they're hairy. And they don't have oil glands to make it waterproof. And so they have to live where there's a lot of food and a lot of water, more in a temperate environment. And also the palm trees that they found down in Antarctica, that's tropical. It's like, so we can explain how come the mammoths froze, but how come they didn't thaw out? That brings us to the big roll. On the Indian Ocean, there's this thing called the 90 East Ridge right here. It's a 3,000-mile feature that points directly to the Himalayas. Okay, and Walt Brown says that the mountains on the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere pretty much cancel out, except for the Himalayas. There's nothing in the southern hemisphere that's going to cancel out the Himalayas. So when you got a big mass on a spinning object, the big mass is going to try to get to the side. Okay, and so that means that the big mass, and you can see this, Brian Nickel did that with the bowling ball. He put some lead on a bowling ball and spun it, and then the lead went to the side. And so that means that something on the top went to the side, so something on the side went to the top. So temperate Mammothville, where there's a lot of water and food, moved up to Mammoth Chill, where it never thawed out. And it cracked this 90 East Ridge because the equator has a bulge there. There's like 18 miles or 30 miles. It's not completely round because there's a bulge at the equator. And so when it rolled through that bulge, it cracked the crust, and that's the feature right there. So my guess would be the Himalayas formed 3,000 miles farther north, and as it spun, it went south, and it cracked this thing for 3,000 miles. And that also took a tropical palm tree and brought it down to Antarctica. And they find dinosaur footprints on every continent, even Antarctica. And so the question today is to the professor, hey, what process today is preserving footprints on every continent? What process today is making arches? Arches National Park, they got however many those arches, and they're falling at about one a year. That can't last millions of years, and we don't see them being made anywhere. What process is making arches? What process is making fossils all around the world? What process is laying down sedimentary rock all around the world? So there was a catastrophe in the past. It was a worldwide flood in the days of Noah, and that's what explains the fossils, the layers of sedimentary rock. And then you're going to see that it even explains what's in our solar system. Okay, so some of this stuff was coming up with such tremendous force that not only did it escape the atmosphere, it escaped the Earth's gravitational pull. And so now you got this ice and dry ice and mud and stuff like dirty snowballs flying around the solar system. Anybody know what's been described as a dirty snowball in our solar system? I think I heard it. What? Comets. Bingo. Yeah, comets flying around. And so Kevin Lee, they had the Stardust mission in 2004, I think. Dr. Brownlee was going to get stuff from a NASA scientist at the University of Washington, I think. He was going to get stuff from the comet and bring it back to Earth. And they said, hey, Walt, you should make a prediction on what they're going to find. And so Walt predicted, I think, but it's stuff from the Earth. He basically predicted you're going to find stuff from the Earth. And then Kevin Lee, he went to where the guy presented his information, and he stood face to face with them and basically said, you're going to find stuff from the Earth and the comet. And their prediction was, no, it's going to be from the Oort cloud, the outer solar system. And he was stunned to find stuff from the Earth. And one of the things they found was cubonite, where it's formed in scalding hot water. It's like, where do you get scalding hot water in our solar system? And it's Earth, in the subterranean water chambers. That's where you get scalding hot water. And so then he emailed the same guy in 2016, and you can see these emails on their website. He's the pastor at Calvary Port Orchard, I think, in Washington, calvarypo.org, I think it is. And you can see these emails. And he basically said, if you try to redirect an asteroid, it'll work if it's a solid rock, but it'll fail if it's a bunch of loosely held boulders, which is what this would predict, loosely held boulders. And so they did the DART mission a few years ago, and it failed, because now we have 38 boulders flying through space, you know, like buckshot or birdshot, and thankfully it's going to miss the Earth. But I mean, I was motivated to get Walt Brown the credit he deserves before he dies. That motivated me. Now what motivates me is we need to get this in the mainstream before NASA makes another blunder that could kill us. Because their perspective of what asteroids are is wrong. And they're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars. And you can see Kevin Lee, and he's been prepared for a time such as this. Decades ago, he was working at the naval shipyard. And they wanted him to do some engineering work, but he wasn't an engineer. So he was studying to pass the engineering test. And he took some orbital physics classes. So he understands what should be happening, and he sees through the smokescreen with NASA. And so, he's prepared for a time like this, and he does these updates, and he shows, and I'll play them at the end. That's Kevin Lee, and now he's a pastor. So God prepared him. So we have this moment in time to destroy the Big Bang. Okay, Walt Brown, he's mentally not as sharp as he could be. You know, I've always wanted to interview him, but they won't allow it. Or even have them ask him questions. I'm fascinated to what advice he'd have for somebody following him. But that hasn't happened. And then Kevin Lee, he's very informed. But we need to hand this theory off to the next generation, because we have this moment in time where we're making accurate predictions. We have a professor who's willing to speak about it. Oh, and he also had a paper published about the trans-Neptune objects that are past Neptune. And he did he submitted a paper and said, because they can't explain some of these orbits. Some are orbiting the wrong way and they can't explain it, but this hydroplate theory does. And so basically he said that those trans-Neptune objects got out there in the rather recent past from the inner solar system. Okay, not from the Oort cloud. And so the physics based, and you can hear him talk, because this poster right here, this is for the very first hydroplate conference. They won't give us a voice at the creation science conferences. They do not accept our papers. And so we finally had to have our own conference. And you can see it at hydroplate.org. You see 3 PhD guys talk. When somebody does a talk on what's wrong with plate tectonics. And so we need to get all the information there. So again, we've got a theory that's only got one assumption. It's making accurate predictions, and we have somebody willing to speak publicly of this. And so we've got the wind at our sails. So now we've got the bullets to take down the Big Bang. We just don't have enough soldiers to take it down. So I'm encouraging people to get informed in this and start influencing your circle of friends, and maybe even start going to school boards after what the last talk was. And just take, if everybody did what you did, what would happen? Would there be a big change or a little change or no change? So I encourage everybody just to do something. You know, those big floods that went through North Carolina, it started with raindrops. You get enough raindrops together, they can't stop us. So if we get enough people thinking for ourselves and not following that propaganda and saying, hey, the emperor has no clothes. And that's what I asked the science teacher, where'd matter come from? I don't know. How'd life begin? I don't know. And so they have faith in the unknown. They have the unknown of the gaps. I've got God of the gaps. But I only need to use them once on the first 6 days, and then we don't need them anymore. Okay, to explain what we see. Okay, so that explains the comets, it explains the asteroids, and people say, well, if that happened, wouldn't it leave a mark on the moon? And it's like, yeah. That's why the near side of the moon is pounded and the far side isn't. You got all those lava flows, those dark spots, that's lava flows, and that's on the near side, not the far side. You know, if this is the moon, it's the near side that's pounded on this side, which is counterintuitive, because the Earth is, anything coming in from on that side is going to hit the moon, or hit the Earth, not the moon. And even if it's coming in from to the top, this gravity is a lot bigger than this gravity, so it should get sucked into the Earth. So the near side is pounded, and it's got mass cons, they call it, a lot of compression marks, and a lot of density there. And it should be on the far side, because that should be peppered all the time. This is protected. But this is where, but basically it just shows that the fountains of the Great Deep exploded with such tremendous force. It pounded the Earth, and that's how the Earth's oldest rock got on the moon, and how the rock was made 6 miles under the surface. It all fits perfectly. And then, there's talk of how there used to be a 360-day year and a 30-day month. I mean, that would make things real easy for signs and seasons. But the Earth lost a percentage of its things, so now it spins faster. So we get more days in a year. And then the moon also gained some things and might have knocked it out of orbit too, maybe. So now we got a 29.5-day month. And so that's basically the hydroplate in a nutshell, but I want you to see what Kevin Lee has to say.
Because I had become a student of the hydroplate theory, I felt fully confident to communicate with Dr. Brownlee and to predict that what he would find was not what he was anticipating. I'm quoting now from his article, A Mission with Many Scientific Surprises. One of the most unexpected was the 2009 discovery of the amino acid glycine. Now, glycine it's an amino acid used by all life. How could the amino acids have been formed in the vacuum and near absolute zero temperature of space? He was shocked by this discovery. The finding that inner solar system materials formed at very high temperature were transported all the way to the edge of the solar system to the region where Pluto is one of the major scientific findings of stardust. But Dr. Brownlee can't explain how, but the hydroplate theory can say.
And you can see that clip on YouTube. It's Twin City TCCSA. We've got a YouTube channel there, and that's one of the shorts. Just type in Kevin Lee, you should be able to see that. And also on that YouTube channel, it's all broken into topics: biology, astronomy, geology, paleontology, history. They get a lot of good speakers there, and I encourage people to start creation clubs. They called me the Johnny Appleseed of creation when I spoke in Virginia. I thought that's pretty good. Just plant creation seeds. But what I want to really plant is a creation tree, where you can plant your own seeds here, where you have a creation club that meets the third Tuesday of every month. You could Zoom our talks and write and have questions and stuff, or just show a movie. But basically, all you need is a place to meet and to understand the importance of this topic. And it can be an outreach to people. There's incredible movies out there. Show Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, and other ones. There's Genesis History. I showed that at Pensacola State College, and or Florida State, one of them. And so there's good information, and we need to, because our students are being taught lies. We need to get this information into their hands. And if they don't let us in the classroom, let them invite them into our church and show them. And because there's a lot of really good stuff that they'd be excited to come back for, especially with Long Story Short. And that was what he had done. That was one of his first, he gave that whole talk, The Origin of Asteroids or something, The Origin of Asteroids and Comets. You can see that whole talk at Twin Cities Creation Science Association. And then they had some other discoveries at NASA. And listen to this.
There's a strange moon of the asteroid Dinkinish. When the Lucy probe was here looking at Dinkinish, it saw this. Oh, another asteroid with a moon. And then it went a little bit further and took another angle at it. And it said, oh, it's an asteroid with a moon that is made up of two components that are contact binaries of the same size. Absolutely impossible, except for the hydroplate theory. Principal investigator for Lucy said in a statement, I would have never expected a system that looks like this. In particular, I don't understand why the two components of the satellite have similar sizes. This is going to be fun for the scientific community to figure out. No, it's not going to be fun. They're never going to figure it out unless they embrace the hydroplate theory premise of how they were sent up into space. Contact binary systems seem to be fairly common. Now there's, oh yeah, this is common to find contact binaries, which was impossible to them a few years ago until they keep finding them everywhere. But scientists hadn't seen one orbiting an asteroid prior to Dinkinish, and we never suspected anything so bizarre. Details of how this unusual moon formed remain mysterious, and it will remain mysterious until people embrace Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory. They'll never figure it out. Scientists were shocked in 1993 when for the first time they saw a moon orbiting an asteroid called Dactyl. They said it was impossible, and then they saw it. Galileo scientists correctly stated that it is virtually impossible, that the moon is a captured object, something created completely separately from light. It is impossible to catch a moon in the vacuum of space. Now, decades later, scientists have found that 17%, more than 245 asteroids have orbiting moons. And now a moon with a moon can only be explained by the hydroplate theory.
And so how do they get moons? Because we get peanut-shaped asteroids, because when things are, they're supposed to blow each other apart. When they hit at those big speeds, they're supposed to blow each other apart, unless they're coming from the same spot with the same force, the same vector, then they'll slowly come together. And some might start orbiting around it. That's how the comets get moons. That's how they come together gently. It's only explained with the hydroplate theory. Notice how they're shocked, just like they're shocked with the dinosaur DNA. They're shocked like crazy, so they're on real thin ice. We just got to get out there and start stomping on the ice so they fall through. And I gave a talk at what was it, Standing for Truth, called "The Emperor Has No Clothes." And I just expose evolution for the fraud that it is. And if we get enough people saying the emperor has no clothes, it loses its power. And so, yeah, the emperor, because you know that story. There's some scoundrels, they convinced the emperor that they made the most beautiful clothes in the world, but you couldn't see it if you were ignorant. And he didn't want them to think that he was ignorant, so he played along. And then he'd send down his helpers to see how they're coming with the loom, making the clothes, and they couldn't see it, but they didn't want to think they were ignorant. And so then finally he's parading himself through the town, and the town doesn't want to think they're ignorant. So they're all playing along with this facade until a boy finally says, "The emperor has no clothes." And then everybody realized they'd been duped. But the emperor, instead of being unashamed, he just proudly kept going along. And that's what evolution's doing. They just proudly keep going along in spite of all the stuff that shows that it's a fraud. And so we just have to realize that we're being misled, help other people realize we're being misled, and then we can have a scientific revolution. And I used this when I was debating the science teacher. He threw up this slide, and I said, "Can you keep that up? Because that validates the hydroplate."
So let me know what you think.
This is the most insane space news in a really long time. This asteroid, called Bennu, is 63 million kilometers away. That's 160 times farther than the moon is. Over the last few years, this spacecraft called OSIRIS-REx traveled all the way there, touched its surface, grabbed a sample, and brought it all the way back to Earth. And what they found in that sample is insane. It's rich in carbon, nitrogen, and organic compounds, all of which are essential to life as we know it, but we've seen that before. The asteroid is also covered in a mineral called serpentine, which looks like this. And these samples look just like the type of rock that we find here in mid-ocean ridges. This is where the stuff from the mantle of the Earth comes up and touches the water. It's underwater. Scientists think that this asteroid could be a chunk of an ancient small ocean world. This could be a piece of an old watery planet that's been traveling through space for billions of years, and we just took a sample of it.
Wow.
What do you think of that?
Wow. Oh my goodness.
We have a few minor tweaks for, first of all, that watery planet, let's call it Earth,
Oh,
as
yeah.
Kevin Lee likes to say. I wanted to get your reaction, Brian, because when I saw that, I'm like, wow, she works for Walt Brown and Real Science Radio in creating a short for us without us having to do all that production effort.
Yeah, she needs a raise, I think. Man.
Well, what everyone just saw on display was an example of a victim of the government schools, a victim of the deceptions and the errors that Brian has uncovered. That girl, to not even consider that this giant water planet is Earth, but that it's been traveling through space for millions of years, is because she has been victimized by exactly what Brian's been uncovering. And it's actually sad. It's sad to see. But it is instructive as to the work we have to do.
Yeah, so we have work to do. You can see these on my YouTube channel, and the heartbeat is there, and then the heartbeat stops. Where are you going to be when your heartbeat stops? That's the intent of that, so they think about the eternity, because right now the big bangers are holding us back. You know, they thought it was junk DNA when it wasn't. They thought it was vestigial organs again when it wasn't. So what we need to do, and there's something on the cheat sheet, and I encourage you to do this. At the bottom it says gifts. You know, if you're going to spend money, spend it in God's kingdom. Just think if all the Christians only supported godly, you know, put all their money into God's kingdom. You know, it just repulses me with every fiber of my being to even think about giving Hollywood a dime, much less my time, or even cable TV. You know, it's just repulsive to me. And so I think if Christians, or even Starbucks, they support abortion, you know? And so let's vote with our money. If we got the Christians voting for godly things and stop supporting ungodly purposes, I think we could make a difference. And that Creation magazine is excellent. You know, they've got a kids section, and it's simple to read. It's not real in depth like the journals, because I don't really have time for that. I like to get a big brush overview, and this is what's happening. And then your kids and your nieces and your grandkids, they would enjoy it. And you might even, I don't know, maybe even have you know, when they took the Bible out of school, one of the things they gave Christians was, yeah, the kids can have an hour a week for religious education. And so they should be able to allow the kids to go an hour a week for a religious education. And so, you know, if there's any way that can become a reality. In other places, they're having breakfasts before school for the kids so they can teach them stuff. So there's a battle. The battle is God's truth versus Satan's lies. And ground zero, I believe, is creation versus evolution. Because if we can get the Creator, you know, that'll solve a lot of things if we have the proper perspective of the past. Because if the Big Bang if the blind chancers are true, well, who am I? Where did I come from? I'm a mutated animal. You know, what am I worth? Well, not much. You know, you're just a bunch of chemicals. Actually, you're part of the problem, and you're using too much carbon. You're going to have to get rid of some of you. And then why am I here? No reason, no purpose. And then where do I go when I die? It's just to the grave. That's if the blind chance perspective is right. And I submit to you that it's not right because it's based on evolution, on imagination and fraud. And the creation perspective is right. This Creator revealed himself in a book that's been historically accurate, scientifically accurate, prophetically accurate, and archaeologically accurate. Oh, a good website is Expedition Bible. It's amazing what they're finding in the ground that validates the Bible. And so that's a good site. And that's the Bible points us to Jesus. So who am I if the creation model is true? I'm made in the image of God. And what am I worth? I'm priceless. You know what Jesus did for me so I could go to heaven? And why am I here? Well, it's to glorify God and help other people get to heaven. You know, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. That's what and I know what the gospel is. And there's a lot of things I don't know about the Bible, but I know those two things. I know the gospel, and I know I'm supposed to preach it. And people need to hear it. And then where do I go when I die? Well, I'm going to heaven. Not based on what I've done, but it's based on what Jesus did for me. And so that's the best message in the world. And so I encourage us to be a light, a creation light and a gospel light. And if there's any way you can start a creation club here, I'd be happy to help you get started. Just because the battle, and it's worth fighting, and we need soldiers. We really do. We have this moment in time where God's prepared Kevin Lee for this, and we're making astounding predictions. This is when we can destroy the Big Bang, which is the pillar of atheism. The other one is the geologic column, okay? And I think we can get rid of one with the hydroplate. And I'm trying to get the CP, or we're trying to get the CP, the creation plate tectonic guys, to talk with the hydroplate guys at a round table, okay? And, And you can see the emails that have been flying. I did a talk on that called Jousting Flood Models. So you can see the emails going back and forth, and the questions they ask shows they don't understand this theory at all. And yet they're the experts that all the other creation speakers are listening to when they say the hydroplate theory doesn't work. And that happened to me personally. I heard a guy speak in Uppsala, and I asked him about the hydroplate, and he says it doesn't work. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because it breaks laws of physics. And I said, which laws of physics? And he said, I don't know, but all the geologists I know don't go along with it. And that's just like an evolutionist, when you ask them about creation, it's like, well, all the evolutionists I know don't go along with creation. So hopefully, and it's getting closer. You know, I talked to one of the leaders yesterday at the conference, and he's saying, well, let's do this privately. Let's get these guys together privately and talk about the pros and cons and come out united. And so hopefully that happens. I say, I don't care how it happens, but let's get this thing into the mainstream before NASA makes any more blunders. And so, anyhow, with that, we got a minute or two. That's a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions at all? Yes?
So my question is how God comes to Noah, says there's going to be a flood for 40 days and 40 nights. Throughout the Bible, you don't find, how does this theory go together with what he said instead of just the flood, and how?
Well, the flood was longer than 40 days and 40 nights. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but the water kept going up. So maybe at that point in time, the fountains were underneath the water, so it couldn't, you know, so it just kind of went. Like if you had a sprinkler in a barrel, eventually it's not going to be shooting out of the barrel anymore with all the water. And so I think there really was a worldwide flood, and I think this is the best model. Oh, that's what we'll do. We'll show you some Bible verses. This shows the water and the earth. But him that stretched out the earth above the waters, that's Psalm 136, and the earth and all the inhabitants thereof are dissolved. I bear up the pillars of it. He thinks those subterranean water, the granite and the mantle were touching. He calls them pillars. And then it talks about, for he that founded it upon the seas and established it upon the flood, Psalm 24. He gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up in depth in storehouses. Well, that's an interesting picture. A storehouse for the flood, Psalm 33. And then this is in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, and the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. And when people try and tell me that Genesis is poetic, it's like, what's poetic about that? You know, that's about as historical as you can get. And Jesus refers to Genesis 1 and 2 in Matthew 19 and Mark 10:6. You know, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus was a creationist, a young earth creationist. He says from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Not millions of years later. And if he's our example, and we're not referring to Genesis 1 and 2 as accurate historical events, we're not following the example of Jesus. And he even said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So it was a worldwide flood. Who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, or as if it had issued out of the womb? Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? We didn't know there were springs of the sea until 1977. You got these hydrothermal vents coming up. They call them black smokers, and some of them are supercritical water coming up. It's like, well, that's interesting. They got supercritical water coming up in the Gulf of Mexico. That's interesting, because, you know, she said, yeah, the science works if the assumption is true. She didn't believe that half of the ocean was inside the earth at one time. And my response is, why don't you believe that? There's water under the ocean today. Okay, that's where the waters from the hydrothermal depths are. But anyhow, and I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. How did they know there were mountains in the ocean? Interesting. The waters were above the water, and the voice of thy thunders, they hasted away. You know, can you imagine what it sounded like when the mountains formed? So that's where my YouTube channel is, and if you watch my hydroplate talks, I normally have where you can get more hydroplate stuff, like Walt Brown, rsr.org, and search Walt Brown, listen to Walt Brown Week. That's what colored in the details for me. And then Brian Nickel, if you want to see it animated and explained very thoroughly. He's an engineer. And engineers love this theory. Because Walt Brown is looking at the earth and is like, okay, what's the force, what's the mechanism, what's the energy? And he looks at it like that, because the geologist says just plate tectonics, convection currents, and he's like, well, what force builds a mountain? What's the force that pushes it up there? And basically what makes the plateaus? And it's gravity. The mountains sink in and it squirts the lava to the side, and then it pops up in segments. So the mechanism is hydraulics, the force is gravity. And the force is gravity for a lot of these. And so I don't know if that answered your question at all, or no?
Yeah, you give us the background. The big thing was where I was going to go from. This to me is more logical than anything I've heard or studied at school or wherever before.
I agree.
It's logical.
I agree. Yeah.
So when God says, let it rain for 40 days and 40 nights, it comes to Noah. The Bible didn't really, during that time period, tell them it was going to be cataclysmic, or cross shifting or breaking or anything like that. That's something that we're going to have to take on faith.
Right.
Didn't
Right.
go into details with it.
Right.
So my other question that I had that was raised is, so this theory states, or is saying that the Ice Age, this brought on the Ice Age, correct? Am I
Yeah.
understanding that right?
Yep.
Okay, so another question that raises my head is, I had these dinosaurs. So 2 of each animal on our.
Yeah.
So we don't have a complete list of what he brought.
No.
Dinosaurs, we assume weren't on there.
Oh, they were. The biblical perspective of dinosaurs is they were made on day 6 with the other land animals. And then 2 of every kind got on the ark. They were young because they could fit through the door. And then the rest of them got killed. A lot of them turned into fossils. And then the dinosaur, they got off the ark and people called them dragons and killed them and carved them into castles and temples and caves and canyons, and they're anatomically correct. So if we never saw them, how could we carve them? And it bothered Carl Sagan so much that he wrote, it's like, how do these cultures separated by time and distance describe the same animal? And so he wrote a book, you can get it on Amazon, Dragons of Eden, where he said that our memories are passed on in our DNA. That was how he explained it, but that's been debunked. So we did see dinosaurs, they just called them dragons. And the Bible describes one in Job 40:15, Behemoth, moves its tail like a cedar. That was a long-necked dinosaur. And
Well, that's great. And then there's questions.
Right.
That I've never heard. I went to local schools, so I have religion every day, kindergarten through 8th grade. So
Yeah.
that's things we didn't cover.
Well, right. Well, a lot of them, like I know a guy, there's a Catholic high school in town, and we used to play baseball with him, so I knew him, and he was growing up. And I said, did they teach evolution at Cathedral? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what do they teach in Bible class? He says, well, in religion class, they teach creation. And I said, so which one's true? He said, it depends which class I'm in. And so what he decided, well, basically, he just learned that he decides what's true. And he can decide what's true in different situations. So eventually, he was living with a girl. And I said, man, you should really marry her, And I was at a community college, and a woman said, my daughter's going through confirmation. And she asked, daughter or niece, one of them, asked the priest about dinosaurs. I said, oh, this will be interesting. And what did he say? And she said, I don't remember, but it didn't make her happy. It was just pretty much, just believe it because I said so. And so then the daughter concluded that either Adam and Eve are false or dinosaurs are false. And how can dinosaurs be false when we find their bones in every continent, And I looked at her and I said, your daughter's real close to kicking the Bible out of her life for the rest of her life. I said, Adam and Eve are true, and dinosaurs are true. The thing that's false is millions of years. And then I plugged her into my dinosaur talk. And hopefully that answered those questions, because kids have good questions, but they're getting bad answers. And I think that's why it's so vital for every community to have a creation club. And I get creation clubs on campus, because we meet at Northwestern, and none of the students or professors know we're meeting. So we started a creation club, got that going, so they could at least announce it at chapel, and then COVID came along and blew it out of the water. So we're starting again, but I mean, there's a lot of heavy lifting to get a creation club on campus, but it can be worth it because you have access to their rooms for free. But it's a lot easier to start one in a community. And that Rockford had one for a while. I don't know if it's still running, but it's because I brought the pastor to the meeting, and then he saw the value, and then he started it. Where you can just Zoom. And TCC is not the only one that puts stuff out there. Nebraska has one. It's called the Great Plains Genesis Forum, and Kevin Lee wrote there, March of 2025, that's the talk that destroys evolution, or the Big Bang. Watch Kevin Lee on that Nebraska one. That talk destroys evolution, or the Big Bang. And so we just got to share it. Yes, is there a question?
Yeah, your theory that you're sharing here about, I'm not going to say the right term, but are there other creationists, like the Institute of Creation Research, who have a different viewpoint
Yes.
of how the Ice Age came about? Because I've read some of their material. They think that the volcanic activity
Sure.
created the atmosphere
Sure.
that caused the rain.
Sure.
So is what we're trying to do, or what you're hoping to do, is help the creation scientists from ICR, for example, to examine your theory of the Earth's early
Yes.
state.
Yes.
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, I think we both agree on the flood model. We both agree that it's after the flood. We just disagree on how the flood happened. And Dr. Randy Galuza, who's going to be speaking in Cambridge on Friday and Saturday, by the way, he's the president of ICR. And when he took over, he wrote a letter to everybody, and he said, I've been given advice that I should promote the ICR brand, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to promote creation. And then he thanked a whole bunch of creation organizations, including Walt Brown's. And that was a huge thing, because it was just like this wall of censorship. And there's a story behind the story on why that is. But you can hear about that at rsr.org/answers if you want to learn about the controversy.
So they may be coming around?
Well, Randy Galuza invited Kevin Lee and Mike Snavely to go in and present the hydroplate theory at ICR, which was huge. And it was very well received, except for one or two exceptions. Because Randy Galuza said, I want to hear what the hydroplate people have to say, not what people say about the hydroplate people. And so I've heard all of Randy's talks. I know what he's going to say, but if I ever get a chance, I always go, and I always thank him for doing that. And he said, I did it last time, and he said, well, the hydroplate's been marginalized for far too long. And so hopefully we get it in there. And if you listen to that jousting flood models and the emails that are flying back and forth, we were actually accused of being part of a satanic assault. Yeah. And that opened up another can of worms for emails. It's like, what are you talking about? And so my response was, hey, if you can end a satanic assault, you should do that. Step up to the microphone at the round table and show us where we're wrong and end this satanic assault once and for all. And so that was my position. But it might take place in private. I don't know how it's going to happen, and I don't care how it happens. I just want to get it out there. And then with their model for the flood is catastrophic plate tectonics, and their fountains of the Great Deep is lava. And fountains and lava are never linked. It's always fountain and water. And then the other thing is they have 6 tidal waves going across the earth. That's their flood. 6 tidal waves. So that's their model. And I look at it, it's just, the secular model is plate tectonics, where the plates move slowly. They just took a secular model and sped it up and said, no, the plates move quickly. Where we've taken something totally different. It's kind of like theistic evolution. They take a secular model and they slap a cross on it. And I think there's a better way. I think that, and if you make accurate predictions, I was actually invited into a classroom one time, and the professor gave me 15 minutes, and I was done in 10 minutes. And the professor, he asked me, I said, any question? He said, yeah, what would you do if you ran science for the day? I said, we'd throw all the theories on the table, and we'd focus on the ones making accurate predictions. That's what we do. And now I think about it, it's like I wouldn't give anybody a grant until they made an accurate prediction. And then I also said we wouldn't teach belief systems about the past. We would just teach science. What's observable, what's testable, not belief systems of the past like the Big Bang and evolution. And there's a whole nother thing, but I've gone over. So I want to respect your time I'll be in the back if anybody has questions, but I want to respect your time, so I appreciate you guys are blessed to have Pastor Mike to allow a creationist the microphone. So you're blessed. I was truly blessed with the music and the scripture and how we are living sacrifices. We're bought with a price, and what we do matters. So I encourage you to just prayerfully consider how you can make an impact in this battle, and then step outside the comfort zone and be Christian soldiers, because this is the funnest battle. I mean, it's so much fun on campus. It is so fun helping people see this, because once you connect the dots, they never see the world again the same. So with that, I'd better end. Again, I'll be in the back. So thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.